Greetings and welcome to this screencast where I will be talking about Google Sheets as a tool for data analysis, both within the quantitative as well as quantitative traditions. So Google Spreadsheets is a really useful tool for both helping us lay out what data we have, as well as thinking about what does all this data actually mean? What does it say about the learning our students have experienced in our classroom? So I'm going to walk you through several different ways we can think about data analysis within our data spreadsheet and ways that we can get our data spreadsheet to do particular things for us. So to that end, this file will be available to you via your Google Drive. It is a file that you can play around with. I've called it Sandbox because you can play around with this data without worrying about making it do crazy weird things with your own data. So if you're looking for a spreadsheet to play around with, you'll have access to this one. So let's get started. The first thing you're going to notice is this is a data collection table. This tends to be my first sheet whenever I'm engaged in a project. What it does is it lays out the data sources that I am collecting in order to get at my question and the dates that I've collected them. So it provides me with an at-a-glance way to think through what do I have, when did I collect it, and the sheets that follow this tend to be analyses of these individual pieces of data. We always want to be thinking through triangulation. You might be looking at the number of data sources that are here and thinking, I don't have 6. That's fine. You want to make sure that your data speaks, your types of data speak to the question that you're answering about student learning in your particular context. This is a hypothetical as a demonstration of what a data collection table could look like. Now, I said that each of these data sources are kind of unpacked in sheets behind this primary collection table. The way that you add a sheet behind your first sheet is by clicking this little plus on the lower left-hand side of your sheet. It says Add Sheet, and what it will do is it'll pop up another sheet that you can add things to. You can rename it, you can duplicate it, you can change colors of it, you can protect it. I'm going to delete it, actually. Yes, I want to delete that sheet because I already have sheets created. So this data collection table is really descriptive. The analysis happens behind the spreadsheets. So let's look at an example. This is coming from a project I did in literacy clinic where I was thinking about kiddos who needed an intervention around their vocabulary usage. So I utilized an instructional routine called Text Talk to think through how that would impact student vocabulary use. So I taped 3 Text Talk lessons. One was my baseline, one was my Text Talk 2, and one was my Text Talk 3. My Text Talk lesson 1 was my baseline. I wanted to see how kids were utilizing vocabulary in one of 4 ways, the targeted vocabulary in the lesson, one of 4 ways. The structure of the vocabulary word, how is it used? Were they able to think through, is that vocabulary word a noun? Is it an adjective? Were they able to talk around those things? What kind of word was it? I wanted to note when they were actually using the vocabulary word itself. Also, when I had to coach them successfully toward the vocabulary word, when was that happening? And then when were they engaged in the practice? How many times did they engage in the structured practice around that vocabulary word? So these were the 4 big things I was looking at in the videos that I was watching. And as I was watching the videos, I counted up how many times I saw them acknowledge the structure of the vocabulary word, where it fits in language, where they utilize the vocabulary word itself, where I had to coach, and where they practiced on their own. So now I'm kind of interested in the total number of instances where they engaged in one of these 4 types of behaviors. And this is where a spreadsheet is really, really helpful because we can use this spreadsheet to do some math for us. So within any given cell, we can ask the Sheets application to add these up for us. And the way that we do that is by typing an equal sign with sum. And this is what it just adds whatever cells we put into these parentheses. The parenthesis is important. It will not add them up unless you have it. So I keep forgetting them. You'll see it. I'll forget it at least 2 times more. So now that I have my parenthesis, I'm going to go back and highlight my 4 cells for student 1, finish my parenthesis, and hit enter. And that just added up all of my cells for student 1. Student 1 had 10 instances of vocabulary use during Text Talk Lesson 1. So I want to see how that compares to the other students in the group. So I'm going to pull this cell down to cover all 4 students. And so it applies that same formula, though it changes it based upon whether it's student 2, student 3, or student 4, to give me the totals for each of these students. So I can see that student 10 has 10 instances. Students 2 and 3 have 14 each. Student 4 has 21. I am interested in the average number of instances of vocabulary use across the 3 lesson plans. So I'm going to utilize a variation of that sum function. Instead of going across, I want the total of the totals. I'm going to divide that by the 4 students. And that'll give me the average number of instances for these particular kiddos. And it's 4.75. So in that cell, I don't think I talked about what I did. You can see your formula up here. I summed it, so I added these cells together, F3 through F6, and then I divided it by 4 because there's 4 students. So that adds this up. It gives me an average, a mean of what these kiddos are doing. If I'm looking at 14.47, that is pretty much in the middle. The exact middle would be 15.5 if we went from 10 to 21. So this is pretty close, particularly since we have 2 kiddos who both scored 14. So that's a really accurate, that's a really representative number for the average. What is the average kid in this small group doing? So I'm going to do that for my 2 other sessions. Parentheses, and I'm going to divide this by 4. 18.25. Oh, whoops. Okay, so notice I didn't divide this one by 4, and so I ended up with a really big number. There we go, much better. So I have 3 different totals. Down here, there are 2, just so that I can look at the averages in one spot, I've created another smaller table within my sheet. There's 2 ways that I can add my averages. I can do equal sign and then click the cell that I want to go there. And the convenient piece about this is if you're setting up a spreadsheet before you have information to put into it, this will self-calculate. So let's say that this is 16 instead. This cell automatically changes. So once you change one thing in the spreadsheet, it will change. Once you use formulas like these, once you change one thing in the spreadsheet, it changes everything in the spreadsheet. So this is 14.75. That should change. The tricky thing about doing that when you transfer, we're going to utilize this table in another spreadsheet. When you transfer that, like we're going to, these cells don't exist in that new spreadsheet, so these numbers go away. So for this case, I am just going to type them in so that they're there and I can move them over. So why am I doing this? I'm not doing it just because I like spreadsheets. I'm doing this because I want to look at whether or not a text talk lesson was effective as an intervention for kids who need help with vocabulary. And what I can do with my averages is I can see really clearly that there is an increase as text talk from the text talk baseline, from the final text talk, kids are increasing in their use of vocabulary. So that's helpful. That is a helpful argument for me to make as a teacher researcher. So I'm going to take, oops, I don't need the whole table. I just need these numbers. I'm going to copy those numbers and paste them into a new sheet. And here's why. Because a table is one thing, a graphic is another. A graphic is a slightly more powerful way to communicate the work that we do as teachers. So let me show you that again. I just realized I'm supposed to be thinking aloud. So here I have a table that is that talks about the average of vocabulary use, and I could get average instance of vocabulary use. So average instance of vocabulary use in Text Talk 1, Text Talk 2, Text Talk 3. It doesn't necessarily have to get any more detailed for this point in time. If I'm making a global argument, like this might be something I include in the beginning of a teacher research paper. Text Talk increased the average instance of vocabulary use by students. Let me show you why. And I could use the table or I could use a chart. And Google Docs allows us to have a couple of different chart options. The chart editor, which is up here in your toolbar, it's third from the right, will provide you with a few options. Right now, the recommendations for this chart aren't exactly great. So the pie chart, it's starting to think that each of these numbers is a smaller part of a whole. It's really not. It's 3 instances in time. So this particular chart doesn't work. The bar graph kind of works. I mean, we definitely see an increase. I don't know that I love it as much as I possibly could. I don't like that one either. So instead, I'm going to go to chart types. And what chart types allows me to do is work through a variety of different kind of types. So there's pies, there's maps, there's all kinds of things that are nice and convey information in a slightly different way. I happen to, for things over time, really like the line graph. This line graph shows specifically how this is going up over Text Talk 1, Text Talk 2, Text Talk 3. I'm going to customize it a little bit. I'm going to give it a title. And insert. So what this does now is it creates a nice table that I can utilize in my action research report that allows me to make a global claim about Text Talk as an instructional intervention. And this copies and pastes. You just copy it utilizing edit, copy, nope, this one, this. And it will go into Google Docs, it will go into Word, and you'll be able to utilize it as you see fit. You can also save image, copy chart, those kinds of things, move to its own sheet, etc., etc. So let's say that we want to move on to a different kind of chart, right? So this is an example in kind of the same project where I'm looking at different types of vocabulary use outside of the Text Talk lesson. So this is looking at how are kids utilizing language outside of the lesson itself. Are they able to identify words when they hear them? Are they able to talk about the word in context? Are they able to apply the word in new ways and utilize it on its own? So this is just for a student, and these are during conversations around a particular vocabulary word that was introduced during the Text Talk lessons. And so I want to chart over time how kids were able to, how this particular child was able to apply different uses of vocabulary over time and how those uses increased, and there was a little bit of a dip. So I'm going to do the same thing where I'm going to highlight my table, I'm going to go up to my insert chart, and it's going to give me a few different options again. And again, some of them are better than others in terms of thinking about what they actually show and what they don't. Uh, the bar graphs are a little kooky. So again, I think I like the line graph because it does show a relationship pretty easily. So that's a nice recommendation. I'm going to change the title. Types of vocabulary use for one student. Insert. And so that gives me another table that I can utilize. So I'm able to utilize this table to make a case that for this particular student across time, outside of a text talk lesson, they were able to engage in 3 particular kinds of vocabulary use. Identification of the word itself, utilizing the context around the word. So they might not know exactly what the word is, but they can point to the context of the word, and then applying and utilizing the word itself. These things all grew, say, for a little bit of a dip when kids were utilizing things in context. So what this kind of graph allows you to do is think about what you are seeing in terms of your student data. So as I'm looking at this particular graph, the thing that I'm noticing is that identification of the word itself increased very highly in the same space where the context decreased. One of the things I can hypothesize from this data is that as kids were able to more clearly identify the word, they didn't have to talk around what the word was. So therefore, their context would actually go down. That's kind of what we're hoping would happen. They would use the actual word itself and not talk around utilizing the context of the vocabulary word. So that explains kind of the why we see a sharp increase here and a little bit of a decrease here. This decrease isn't necessarily a terrible thing. It's another tool that we want kids to be using, but it's one that we want them to be using less and less and less as they identify the specific words themselves. And so that provides me things to talk about within my paper. So I can use this as a launching pad and then unpack it. I can save it or copy it and put it in my document and unpack it for my reader in the paper itself. And this is the same. I just did that. I should have saved it for this particular graphic, but I didn't. So anyway, another thing that we can do with this is do an average of the identification context applications, again, to see which one did they utilize the most, which one did they utilize the least. I think at this point we'll find that they did use context the most, but there was an increase in identification of the specific word over time, so I won't do that. But those are some things that you can do with qualitative data within Google Spreadsheets to think about why are we collecting these numbers? What do they actually tell me? What's interesting about them? How can I do this without having to crack open my calculator? So that's quantitative data, numerical data, data that can come from surveys, data that can come from rubrics, come from quizzes, come from counts. Anything that we can count, we can quantify. If there's stuff that we can't necessarily quantify, for instance, if we are doing interviews with kids about how do they feel about independent reading, or how do you feel as a dual language learner, what are some of the barriers, what are some of the things that really help you in class, you may want to think through a coding scheme for your interviews. And one of the things that I find really helpful in coding schemes is as you're thinking about your interviews, you want to identify larger themes, right? Just as in a narrative text, theme is what the book is really about. Themes in your interview are what the interview is really about. What is the interviewee really telling us, really talking about? So this is a coding scheme for an interview from interviews that I did with teachers and teachers who were working on writing and how they felt as writers and teachers of writers. So I had my coding scheme. My coding scheme came out of my interviews. I read my interviews over and over and over again and tried to figure out what they were really about. How could I group them in terms of ideas, and the ideas that emerged from this particular interview and this particular series of interviews revolved around teaching and around personal experience. And so when we're coding things qualitatively, one of the things that's really important is we have to delineate or articulate why we're coding things in a particular way. So you'll notice down below, I talk about why this first major category. What do these particular codes have in common? And so this one, we're talking about the official materials of the classroom and the doing of curriculum within the classroom. And then personal experience is the history this particular participant brought with her and how that translates to classroom practice. I had two subcategories: personal things within teaching, reasoning behind becoming a teacher, these doubts within becoming a teacher, and glue. Why did she stay in the classroom? Like, why it had less to do with her personal background and more of her identity as a teacher and how that feeds into her writing instruction. And then thinking through curriculum, there were several things I noticed that she talked about over and over again with curriculum in terms of risk, integration, restriction, freedoms, frustrations, writing, influences, and writering was how I phrased it. And then down below, thinking about the personal experiences that she had within school, generalizations and differences, operationalizations, perceptions of self, positive experiences, writing habits, and audience fright were all codes that came out of Sophia. Qualitative coding is tricky, and sometimes it takes a while to figure out what those codes are and how they best fit within the interviews that we're collecting. So down at the bottom of this spreadsheet, I've included an example of code sorting. So if I've collected all of my codes and I'm trying to think through how all of these codes come together and where they are in all of the interviews, this is an example of a code sorting. What I've done is I've looked at my interview, where I've coded or highlighted particular codes, and I've just organized them. I've grouped them based upon whether it's a curriculum code and whether she's talking about risk within curriculum, integration within curriculum, restrictions within curriculum, freedoms within curriculum. And what this allows me to do as I'm sorting all of these codes from my interview is, as I'm writing up my findings, I can talk really, really easily about, I'm going to talk about teaching first and where these codes are coming from. I'm going to start with the personal, and all of my personal codes are right there. I'm going to talk about historical narratives first, and then I'm going to move into glue. And all of the data is already there. I don't have to go back and forth within the interviews. It really does save a lot of time to do a code sort like this in that way. So you can see an example of what that looks like. The link to this document is at the bottom of this spreadsheet. I talked a little bit about the write-up and what this qualitative write-up would look like. I've included an example of that as well for one of the participants in this study. So it's a really brief, about 6-page long write-up of her particular interview, but you can see where the code sorting directly fed into the write-up of the data. So that is an example of a qualitative code, of a qualitative coding scheme for interviews and or observations that you are working with that deal with qualitative data, stuff that can't be quantified. If you are going to do some kind of qualitative analysis, you want to make sure there's a coding scheme included in your appendix. You want to account for where these codes came from and what they mean to you. That's part of the validity piece. So That wraps up this particular screencast. We've covered a lot of stuff, including how to use Google Spreadsheets as a tool, the various things that we can do with Google Spreadsheets around data analysis, both qualitative and quantitative. So hopefully this has been helpful in terms of organizing your own thoughts about what to do with your teacher research data.